You're 18 months out from selling your business. You have a growth plan, you have a pipeline, you have a story. But the playbook you wrote 2 years ago, or even 6 months ago, no longer matches the economy you're selling into. And AI is rewriting what buyers think a great growth plan even looks like today. The companies commanding premium values in this market aren't just growing, they're growing in ways that prove the business is built to what comes next. Today's guest, Marc Emmer, is president of Optimize Inc., a Vistage International speaker, an Inc.com contributor, and author of Momentum, How Companies Decide What to Do Next. Marc facilitated strategy for more than 200 organizations, and he spends his days helping CEOs answer exactly that, what to do next and why it matters now. Marc, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Keith. Good morning. Greetings from Southern California.
Well, we're glad you're in sunny Southern California. We're catching up with you this spring. Summer is around the corner. So, I always say buyers pay based on historical earnings, but they buy based on growth. You've worked with hundreds of companies to help them maximize value and prepare for exit. What are some of the key takeaways, some of the key patterns you see or you work with owners or CEOs on to help them get there? Say, whether it's 12 months, 24 months, 36 months or longer, so they have that growth story ready to go.
Yeah, I'm sure it's intuitive to many of our listeners that to sell a business requires many of the same things as just running a successful business. But I'd say there's a couple of things that jump out at me. First of all, surrounding yourself with the right advisors is really critical. I think people like you are worth their weight in gold, but also, having the right transactional attorney and the right CPA. Your current CPA may not be a transactional CPA, and of course, right management team, people such as strategy consultants and that type of thing. But I think that the biggest issue is your market position. So you don't want to put your banker in a position where they have to spin for you. You want to already achieve some form of market leadership. I think most commonly what happens in private companies is the premium transactions are for those who have positioned in a way that a larger entity, maybe even a public company, wants to buy their way into a market, and you happen to be the company that is controlling that market. So I think market position is just as important, or maybe even more important, than the economics of the deal itself.
Yeah, so that's really important because we, like you said, we have to spin it sometimes, right?
Yeah.
And like when we're talking, we run our process and we do we call a question answer a phase through it. We have to submit questions and we'll get answers and whatnot. But they always say, "Why aren't you doing this?" or "How come you're not doing this?" Right? And we have owners who are at the back end of their careers, and a lot of the things we're talking about require investment. And so we say, this is an opportunity for you, right? This is an opportunity for you to monetize that long term, right? This is important to you. So how do you prepare them for that growth discussion? Because it is a stumbling block because you're at the back end of your career and you're thinking exit, you're not thinking growth. But it's all about growth. That's where the value premium is, like you were talking about earlier. How do you work with them and have that discussion? I'm sure you've had multiple discussions with owners at various stages of the career, but give me a couple ideas how that works so they actually can command a premium valuation when they're looking to exit.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. They're not always hyper focused on the growth story, and often they have a lot of client concentration risk, or they may have sector concentration risk. So often when we're hired to do strategic planning is when companies are trying to grow their way out of that, right? So that's often about diversification, entering new markets. It might be doubling down on the markets they're already in. But to your point, I think what happens for the business owner is, they get stuck in their own head. And that's why a lot of the data suggests that when sellers have earnouts, they only get to the end of their earnout like half of the time because they get kind of checked out, right? So to your
Yeah.
point, I think the entrepreneur really needs to prepare themselves mentally for what an exit might look like and also what it's going to look like on the other side.
Yeah, I think that's important because in today's market, we are seeing more structure in deals, uh, i.e., contingent notes, earnouts, and typically, and we've talked about this before. Typically, the owner is going to be invested in staying on with the business to help achieve that, so they can maximize that earnout. And you
Yeah.
said, don't check out, right? They tend to check out, and they got a nice big payday, whether it's high seven figures, eight figures, whatever, at closing, and it's like, okay, but sometimes their priority switches um, to the detriment of themselves and their family because of the money, and also the buyer because if they're not hitting the earnout, they're not hitting the growth. And there's always this misconception out there, in my opinion, because people hear horror stories with sellers. Well, earnouts, I'm going to get quote unquote. I'm never going to get it. They're going to do everything they can not to get the earnout. I don't I don't agree with that. I think they want you to get the earnout, right? They want that because if you're hitting it, the value's there, the company's growing, and that legacy of what you've achieved for all these years and is now you're going to realize that because it's going to continue on past when you retire after you finally leave the company. So, you know, executing on that growth plan, if is critical. So, especially like in today's economy, I mean, there's a lot of moving parts. I call it. It's last 5 years have been frankly chaotic for various reasons. Whether it's COVID, whether it's tariffs, whether it's war, whether it's tax policy, whether it's elections, there's something that's constantly happening. I mean, we had a wonderful, incredible, high valuation pre-COVID with, but back in 2019 before the COVID. And now you're trying to work on a strategy when there's a certain uncertainty and lack of visibility. How do you work with the companies, to get ready for that or work in that environment, I should say.
I often like to tell a story of about a time when Wynton Marsalis, the great jazz musician, appeared on 60 Minutes after his father had died of COVID. And he talked about the principles of improvisation. And he said that in times of chaos, we need to be more deliberate. We need to be more process driven. In other words, we earn the right to be agile through preparation. So, as a strategic planning consultant, I'm in the preparation business. And I think that if you really want to be agile, it's about building out the right systems and having the right people and the right process and the right business model and all of that so that you can adapt quickly to change. And clearly the companies that survived the liquidity crisis or COVID or any of the other chaotic events we've had in recent years have been the ones who've done the contingency planning. They're the ones that had a succession plan. They're the ones that did all the work that we're going to be talking about today, so that they're in a position to succeed regardless of the marketing environment, regardless of the market.
Yeah. So when you're you're working with a client, you're consulting with them, strategic planning. You may have the CEO, maybe co-CEOs, right? It may be two brothers, or brother sister, or father son, father daughter, or multiple family members at the table.
Right.
Some people don't agree, surprisingly, on what we should do with the business. So, and we, for our perspective, is like you got to keep it behind the wall here. You can't show any kind of inconsistency. You have to have a common message from everybody when you're dealing with the buyer pool, because if it comes from different ways and different things, that raises the skepticism meter, which means it lowers the valuation and gets the buyer nervous. So when you're in that room with more than one, right? And there's possibly a dominant figure who the father has been doing the business, and the two sons or two daughters, whoever, and you're trying to help them create a growth strategy so they are in a position to maximize value. How do you work that crowd?
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say it could, I wouldn't say it would be dissimilar with any management team, whether it's family held or not.
Right.
Right. But, I think of a strategy like it's a sheet of music and we're a symphony and everyone has to play their part or the music's not going to sound very good. But I think if you're uber clear on what success looks like and what the end game is, and all of the family members or members of the management team are marching towards that same end game, then when you achieve it, there should be agreement on, where you have arrived. So I think if you're executing strategy well and you have the right process, it should enable a company to reach that desired end game and maximize their valuation. But that's also, that's hard work. That's everyone doing their part. And so again, if you're pre-exit, you got to be doing the right things. Your buy-sell agreement should make it very clear who's in control in case there is that conflict at the
Right.
end. So there's things that you could be doing along the way to make sure that you're in the right position when that day comes.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. And then this is a side note when you say the buy sell, right? I mean, some of these buy sells are written 40 years ago, 30 years
So
ago.
bad. Yeah.
They're just not relevant today. And so you have a descending shareholder. You want to do a stock deal because why? Because it's cleaner. Traditionally, the tax implications are less than an asset deal, right? Capital gains versus maybe ordinary income. And you got to get everybody on board. And then you have a shareholder who, even though you can do the transaction because you have a majority, you still have a minority shareholder dissenting. And they said, I'm not doing the deal. So what do you end up doing to get it done? If the buyer's agreeable, you end up doing an asset deal and it costs you money. Everybody, including the dissenting shareholder, right? So, I mean, I think, reviewing those documents is part of, moving forward as you're preparing, that legal due diligence piece. As you said, that buy-sell agreement. I mean, some of these things are, lack of a better word, stale. They just are not relevant in today's marketplace. So,
yeah, but I think what you're speaking to is something even broader than that. And that is people don't want to have crucial conversations, right? You don't want to have a crucial conversation when you're in a sell process and a buyer has now come forward with an offer and we're not aligned on what success looks like. That work needs to happen well in advance.
Right. And
yeah,
it's the planning. It's that 24 months before or 30 or 12 months before is that getting that alignment. And even sometimes you don't get the alignment, but you're moving forward the transaction. And, it's unfortunate because these are typically, either partners, right? And, and you don't want to see that dissension, but alignment's key to a growth strategy, a consistent message to the buyer once you're in market is critical because once that gets you get any breaks in that messaging, it raises questions, and a lot of buyers will flee right off the get-go. So, as we're talking through strategy, it's not just about growth; it's about alignment, which is kind of leans into your strategy of growth when you have these conversations. But I'm sure when you're sitting there talking about growth, all this other stuff comes up through the as I call it, seeps through the floorboards of things that people have ignored, not addressed, or not spoken up about. And there you are sitting in a room thinking you're talking about growth. Next thing you know, you're acting as a therapist.
Yeah, well, that happens to me all the time. I'll tell you when I think it's particularly troublesome is you talked about the family businesses earlier. Often what happens is you may have a change of control that's generational. And dad's in his 80s and the kids are all posturing for who's going to run the business, and dad's in bad health, and then they decide they want to exit and they're negotiating from a poor position. If you have the right line of succession and everyone's roles and responsibilities are clear, and the family has actually had a conversation about who's doing what and
Right.
why and what their wealth is going to look like on the other side, then maybe they have a chance to optimize their value. And if they don't do that, they're going to have a very clumsy transaction.
Yeah. So it's interesting because I'm just popped in my head right now is like you brought in for a growth plan the message, but when it comes down to it, you're also brought in from a succession perspective because you need everybody needs to be in alignment. So you find yourself talking about strategy, and then not just from strategy of the business, but strategy of the family or the stockholders, is that everybody is in sync, because that's critical. I mean, I can tell you, where we got over the finish line, but it was challenging behind the curtain. I had a situation where, the son and the son didn't want it to go, and the father says, "I need to go," right? And he did everything in his power, even though he's a minority shareholder, to block the business, and including setting up another company in a different state that does similar work that we disclosed to the buyer. But it took a lot of, let's say, a lot of long, hard conversations to get him finally to understand what's important to his father, right? It's time for him to go. And you're here because of your father, not because of what you've done. And those are hard conversations. And it took a long time, but the buyer really wanted this business. So they stuck in it. I would say 99 other buyers would have walked away, but they stuck in it. So to your point on this, alignment, growth, preparing for sale, it's also preparing everybody to be in a line. And we've had deals that fallen apart because of that. And it's a shame, because the founders really needed to get out.
Yeah, I would also say that rubs two ways. So I think generally there's an impression that when there's a very successful family business and a new generation comes in, that those younger family members might be entitled in some way. They probably grew up with some wealth and so on. And they may not be as dynamic as the original entrepreneur was. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes the opposite's true. Sometimes the kids come in and they're more technologically savvy. They're more ambitious. They want to grow faster. They're willing to make investments their parents were unwilling to make. And
Right.
sometimes they are actually the growth engine. So, it's the answer to any question in business. It all depends. But I've seen that work out in different ways. I also wanted to mention something you brought up earlier. I think the reason why earnouts often don't work out is because the seller is holding on too tight to what they did before.
That's a
So
good
if
point.
you're in an earnout situation and now you're working for somebody else, it's not your problem anymore. Someone else owns the business, right? So
Right.
you are there to shepherd a successful transition, and you should do that responsibly. But it's a little crazy to be holding on to things that you did before the transaction when it's really somebody else's responsibility at that point.
Yeah, they want you to drive growth based on certain skill set you have, whether that's the customer relationship, getting out there and selling new product, whatever. You're right, though. You're holding on to everything after post, it could be a detriment to getting to that number. That's a very good point.
Yeah.
So,
Also, one other thing,
yeah,
you talked about some of the trials and tribulations with sellers who go to do the earnout, and for whatever reason, that their perception is that the buyers will, resist paying them out. I agree with you that that is not necessarily true. And in fact, I've had several clients in transactions recently that not only did they max out their earnout, they got stock in the purchasing company, which was more valuable than their business was.
right.
I've had situations where the earnout was extended and maybe the person was elevated to a more senior role in the business. So they actually were able to earn and enjoyed working for someone else instead of having all the responsibilities of running the business themselves.
Yeah, so again, if you find the right buyer and you do your due diligence and you work with folks like us to make sure you're bringing high qualified, ethical buyers to the table, the outcome could be very rewarding. And I said, when you roll equity to a new company, that second bite of the apple, as we call it, and a lot of times is worth more than the first bite. You got 10 million for your company. You stayed with it for 3 years. They sell out down the road at a 3X or 4X or 5X. The next thing you know, you get another check for 20 million. Right. And you contributed. And as you said, you did the stuff you'd like to do, and everything else was, so the wealth equation becomes, just magnified by a successful outcome like that. So, Marc, this is such an important topic. Growth is key to a successful transaction, the implementation and awareness of AI. There's so much to talk about. We'd love to have you come back for another podcast to kind of continue our conversation. If you enjoyed today's podcast, we have similar episodes by clicking the link below. Again, my name's Keith D., President of Osage Advisors. Thank you for being with us, and have a great day.